At 17:31 hours on November 4, 1944, Squadron Leader Branse Burbridge climbed into a de Havilland Mosquito at RAF Swannington and watched Germany's night sky appear on a screen that wasn't supposed to exist. Not a map, not a radar picture of terrain. A ghost map made of enemy emissions. Thin needles of light, pulses, flickers. The invisible heartbeat of German night fighter radar, Lichtenstein, spilling into the air like cigarette smoke in a dark room. Burbridge didn't need to see the enemy to find him. He only needed the enemy to breathe. Because tonight, the RAF wasn't hunting aircraft. They were hunting signals. Flight Lieutenant Bill Skelton, navigator and radar operator, settled into the right-hand seat and adjusted a box of wires and dials mounted where other crews carried nothing but hope. The device had a bland name, Serret, and that was part of its genius. Detector sounded harmless. Detector sounded defensive. But Serret wasn't defensive. Serret was a way to turn German technology into a flare, a beacon that betrayed every night fighter that trusted it. Outside the cockpit canopy, the Mosquito's wooden skin absorbed the cold air. Merlin engines ticked and shuddered. Ground crew moved like shadows beneath floodlights that were never bright enough. In the distance, other aircraft were warming up too. Lancasters, Halifaxes, heavy bombers that carried men who would spend the next 6 hours living inside the sound of their own fear. In October alone, Bomber Command had lost hundreds of aircraft across a month of operations. Some nights, crews returned to empty dispersal points that had been full at dinner. And the worst part was how cleanly it happened. A bomber would be alive, steady, on course. Then the sky would reach up and tear it open. No warning, no dogfight. Just a burst of cannon fire from below, and a heavy aircraft would become a falling bonfire. The Germans had a name for the technique. Schräger music, upward-firing cannons mounted to strike into the belly of bombers from beneath, where gunners rarely looked, and where flame could race through fuel tanks and wing spars before anyone even understood they were dying. The bomber crews never saw what killed them. The night fighters did, and the night fighters believed their radar made them untouchable. They were all wrong, because the night has rules, until one side breaks them. Tonight, Burbridge and Skelton were breaking the first and most sacred rule of German night fighting, that Lichtenstein radar was a secret language spoken only between hunter and prey. The RAF had learned to listen. And once you can listen, you can follow. Once you can follow, you can kill. This is the story of the night the Mosquito crew stopped trying to outrun German pilots and started hunting German radar. It's the story of an invisible war inside the visible one. And it's the story of what happens when a secure technology becomes the thing that gets you murdered in the dark. To understand why Serret mattered, you have to understand what the Germans built by late 1944. Night fighting wasn't chaos anymore. It was a system. German ground controllers used radar stations to steer fighters toward bomber streams. Once near enough, the fighter's own onboard radar, Lichtenstein, took over. The aircraft would creep in behind or beneath a bomber, often unseen, and then fire at ranges so close the impact looked like lightning inside the bomber's fuselage. By 1944, German crews were professionals at this. Many had double-digit victory tallies. Some were legends in their own squadrons, and they believed the British were still playing the old game. Find the fighter with eyes, with luck, with searchlights. But the RAF had formed something new, a group built specifically to fight the night fighters. Number 100 Group. Its mission wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a daylight aces war of contrails and sunlight. 100 Group was an ecosystem of electronic warfare, jammers, spoofers, signal detectors, specialized Mosquito squadrons that supported the bomber stream like bodyguards walking in the shadow of a crowd. Their purpose was brutally simple. Hunt the hunters. And that demanded a new kind of skill. Because if you were an intruder Mosquito crew, you weren't just flying a fighter, you were flying a logic puzzle at 250 knots. You had to navigate by dead reckoning, radio silence, brief flashes of instrument light. You had to cross coastlines bristling with flak. You had to avoid German radar coverage while searching for German aircraft that were doing everything they could to remain unseen. And then, if you found them, you had to kill fast and disappear before the entire Luftwaffe woke up. The attrition was real. Mosquito squadrons didn't lose crews like bomber squadrons did, but when a Mosquito went down at night, it often vanished without a trace. No mayday, no parachutes, just a wooden aircraft hitting the ground at fighter speed. So when people talk about 100 Group's secret war, remember this. It wasn't secret to the men inside the cockpit. It was secret to the men who didn't come back. RAF Swannington in Norfolk became one of those places where the night always felt like it was waiting. The station hosted Mosquito units tasked with intruder operations, lingering near enemy airfields, catching fighters on takeoff or landing, or intercepting them as they formed up to attack bomber streams. The Germans called it terror. The RAF called it necessary. And in that ugly space between those two truths, Burbridge and Skelton built their partnership. Branse Burbridge was young, only in his early 20s, and he carried a history that didn't fit the stereotype of a killer in a night fighter. Earlier in his life, he had refused violence. He had been a conscientious objector, a man who didn't want war, but war doesn't always care what kind of man you want to be. By 1944, Burbridge had flown dozens of combat sorties, not because he had become bloodthirsty, because he had become convinced that the only way to save men being murdered in the dark was to stop the machine doing the murdering. He became a hunter to shut down a slaughterhouse. Skelton was different. Navigators often were. A pilot could sometimes survive on instinct and muscle memory. A navigator could not. At night, across occupied Europe, with cloud layers and radio deception and the ever-present risk of being shot down by a battery you never saw, navigation was life. And Skelton brought more than navigation. He brought Serrate. Not the box itself. Any crew could carry the box. Skelton brought the ability to make Serrate speak clearly under stress, to interpret signal strength, to call turns that would put a Mosquito exactly where it needed to be, behind a night fighter that thought it was alone. Together, they were not just pilot and navigator. They were predator and sense organ. And the weapon they carried wasn't only for Hispano cannons. It was the fact that the Germans were broadcasting their own position every time they tried to find a bomber. That's the part that sounds like science fiction if you've never lived inside radar warfare. The Germans believed radar was a flashlight only they could see. Serrate proved it was a flashlight that revealed the man holding it. The RAF didn't have to break German encryption. They didn't have to read German orders. They didn't have to hack anything. They just had to sit in the dark and listen to the buzzing of a radar set and follow it like a moth follows a lamp. Serrate was not a magic kill switch. It did not give Burbridge a perfect radar picture of a German aircraft. What it gave him was something both simpler and more terrifying. Direction. A bearing to the source of the radar emission. If a German night fighter switched on Lichtenstein, Serrate could detect it at long range, dozens of miles under good conditions. But it wasn't range finding in the clean, modern sense. Skelton had to infer distance from signal strength, from the way the needle danced, from the way the tone changed in his headset. In other words, it wasn't just equipment, it was skill. And by late 1944, German crews were trying to adapt. They were told to minimize radar use. Some used it in short sweeps, hoping to remain silent. Others kept it on continuously because they knew the alternative, blindness. Because bomber streams were huge. Without radar, German fighters would never find them in cloud, never approach unseen, never line up a Schrager music shot. So they kept broadcasting. And every broadcast was a confession. I am here. To the Luftwaffe, radar was security. To Burbridge, radar was a trail of breadcrumbs. And on November 4th, 1944, that trail was thicker than Skelton had seen in weeks. Multiple contacts, multiple emissions, a sky that sounded crowded, like a room full of men whispering with the lights off. The briefing earlier that day had been blunt. Bomber Command would strike targets in the Ruhr region, industrial nodes that fed the German war machine. Night fighters would scramble. They always did. They would climb, form up, and wait for vectors toward the bomber stream. Burbridge and Skelton's job was to be in the wrong place at the right time, inside the German hunting ground before the German hunters arrived. The Merlin engine started with a sound like restrained violence. Burbridge checked magnetos, props, boost. Skelton checked the instruments that mattered to him: compass, drift, airspeed, and the electronic boxes that turned darkness into information. The Mosquito rolled, lifted, and climbed into the blackening sky. Below them, Swannington became a small constellation of lights surrounded by farmland. Ahead, the North Sea. Then the coast of occupied Europe. Then Germany. Their route was built around avoidance. Avoid the obvious radar coverage. Avoid flak belts. Avoid predictable tracks. They crossed at low altitude where possible, then climbed when they had to, balancing fuel, oxygen, and tactical advantage. At altitude, you could see more, but you could be seen more too. And the Luftwaffe had eyes everywhere, not just human eyes. Radar eyes. Skelton's serrate began to murmur. Not a sentence yet, just the hint of a language, a tick, a pulse, a faint rising tone that meant there was German radar somewhere ahead. It was like walking through a forest and hearing the first crack of a twig. You didn't know where the animal was, but you knew it existed. By the time they were deep over occupied Europe, the darkness was full of those sounds. Some were weak, some were strong, some were steady. Some disappeared and returned, German crews flicking their radar sets on and off in nervous sweeps, trying to be both hunters and ghosts. Skelton began calling bearings. Burbridge began turning the Mosquito like a knife seeking a gap in armor. This is what most people don't understand about night intruder fighting. It is not a swirling melee. It is geometry. Two aircraft in a void, each trying to occupy the space behind the other. And with serrate, Burbridge didn't need to see the aircraft to begin that geometry. He could start shaping the intercept while the German crew still believed they were alone. Before we go into the first intercept, because what happens next is exactly where the night war changes, take 1 second to support WWII's hidden chapters. If this kind of story matters to you, stories that don't show up in school textbooks, hit the like button. It tells the algorithm this history is worth keeping alive, and if you want more deep dive WWII episodes, night fighters, radar wars, tank duels, impossible missions, subscribe and turn on notifications. All right. Back to the dark. At roughly 1904 hours, Skelton's serrate tone sharpened. A contact. Stronger now. Crossing starboard to port. Burbridge eased the Mosquito onto the bearing. Not a hard turn, not aggressive. Just a smooth slide into position, the way you stalk something that might spook. The German aircraft ahead was working. That meant radar on. That meant serrate was already winning. Skelton's voice was calm, almost clinical. Steady. Contact strengthening. Left 2 degrees. Burbridge held the aircraft stable and let speed do the work. The Mosquito was fast, faster than most German night fighters at the altitudes where this happened. And speed meant choice. Choice meant survival. At 1,500 feet below the cloud layer, Burbridge caught the faintest outline against a darker slice of sky. Twin engines, a long fuselage, a silhouette that matched the menace Bomber Command hated. A Junkers Ju-88 night fighter variant, 3 men inside, confident that the British were still blind. They weren't. Burbridge closed to within 1,000 feet. Then 800. He could see exhaust stubs glowing dull red. He could see the vague geometry of radar aerials, and he aimed the gun sight not at the cockpit, but at an engine. That was his rule when possible. Stop the machine, give the men a chance. He fired a controlled burst, short, disciplined. 4 Hispano cannons hammered the night. For a moment, the shells were just invisible violence. Then the port engine flashed and became a torch. The Ju-88 rolled hard, diving away, fire streaming from its wing root. Burbridge pulled up instinctively to avoid debris. Skelton watched until the glow vanished into cloud. No one saw the impact, but both men knew what fire like that usually meant. 1 German hunter removed, and the bomber stream hadn't even reached its turning point yet. Skelton barely finished logging the time when Serret spoke again. Another contact, intermittent, as if the German crew were trying to be clever. Short radar sweeps, silence, then another sweep. Smart, disciplined. But it didn't matter, because even silence is a pattern. And pattern can be predicted. Burbridge held course until the tone returned, then turned gently onto the bearing. The Mosquito crept up behind the signal. Minutes later, there it was again. Another Ju-88, radar aerials longer, a newer set. Perhaps the crew believed upgrades made them safer. Perhaps they believed British detectors couldn't keep up. They were wrong. This intercept was riskier because it was heading toward a known danger point, the airfield region southeast of Cologne, an area where night fighters often formed up. If Burbridge chased too far, he'd be in the middle of enemy traffic. But if he didn't chase, that German aircraft would be free to murder bombers. So he chased. At 400 feet back, Burbridge fired another short burst, again engine-focused. The starboard side erupted in flame. This time the fire spread faster, as if fuel had been waiting for a spark. The Ju-88 pitched down and rolled, losing lift. Skelton tracked it long enough to see it become a falling, spinning flare. Then it disappeared below the cloud deck. 2 kills. 11 minutes. And now Skelton's scope began filling with something worse. Multiple contacts, different bearings, different ranges, converging. A pack. The Germans weren't just hunting the bomber stream, they were forming up for it, and Burbridge was about to fly into the middle of their staging area. The lights of an airfield appeared beneath broken cloud, scattered points of illumination in an otherwise featureless black. Skelton counted the returns, 6 contacts within a few miles, orbiting in a slow circle, stacking at different altitudes. A classic night fighter waiting pattern. German pilots did this because it worked. They would circle a beacon point. Ground control would assign altitude blocks. When the bomber stream approached, the fighters would peel off in sequence, guided by controllers like pieces on a board. It was organized. It was deadly. Burbridge reduced power slightly and descended. Not too fast. Not too obvious. He watched his instruments because outside there was nothing but darkness and the faint suggestion of cloud edges. Skelton's serrate tone became almost constant. They were inside the radio noise of multiple radars. Most pilots would have turned away at this point, because this was the nightmare scenario. 1 Mosquito over enemy territory, surrounded by multiple night fighters, each capable of killing you with a burst you'd never see coming. But Burbridge made a decision that sounded insane even to some RAF crews. He joined the orbit. He slid into the German pattern, the way a thief steps into a line of men waiting for a train. No lights, no identification, just speed, spacing, and the absolute arrogance of darkness. For 90 seconds, they flew with the enemy, a German aircraft ahead, another behind, all of them doing the same gentle turn, the same airspeed, the same altitude band, and none of them looking at each other, because they didn't need to. Their radar was pointed outward, searching for bombers, not checking the aircraft sharing their circle. And the Germans assumed that anything inside the pattern was German. Because why would an RAF aircraft be here? That assumption is what got them killed. Skelton whispered spacing adjustments like a man defusing a bomb. Close ahead. Keep it smooth. Don't climb. Don't drop. Burbridge held the Mosquito steady. He chose a target in the orbit, a heavier silhouette, twin tail booms, a shape that looked like the kind of night fighter that carried confident crews. A Bf-110. He eased closer. 500 feet. 400. In the gun sight, the aircraft's exhaust glowed. The cockpit canopy reflected almost nothing. It was a machine and a shadow, and it was about to go to the bomber stream. Burbridge fired. 3 seconds. The cannons pounded. The port engine exploded into orange flame. The Bf-110 rolled out of the orbit like a dying bird, dropping beneath the circle and vanishing downward. Burbridge pulled up and away, not because he wanted distance, but because he needed to avoid collision with the aircraft behind him. And now, the orbit broke, because explosions are a language everyone understands, even at night, even in cloud. The German pattern scattered. Contacts on Skelton's scope peeled away in different directions. Ground control began transmitting warnings. The system that had made German night fighting deadly was now screaming in panic. But chaos creates a different danger. A German pilot might now look inward instead of outward, might stop searching for bombers, might search for the intruder. And one of them did. Skelton called it fast. Contact, turning toward us, range closing. Burbridge banked hard. The Mosquito tilted, engines growling as he pulled into a turn that aimed directly at the incoming aircraft. If the German expected the Mosquito to run, this would steal his advantage. Night combat was about who controlled the merge, and Burbridge chose control. The incoming aircraft appeared suddenly, a darker shape cutting through the black. Closure rate was insane, hundreds of knots combined. This wasn't a careful stalk anymore. This was 2 machines on a collision course. The German opened fire first, tracer streaking past the Mosquito's wing. Close. Too close. Skelton's radar return confirmed the contact was almost on top of them. Burbridge held his nerve. He waited until the silhouette filled the gun sight, then fired. Not a short burst this time, a longer, desperate stream, because at head-on range you don't get second chances. The rounds tore through the front of the German aircraft. Glass shattered. Metal sparked. An engine caught, then another. The enemy fighter pitched up sharply, rolled inverted, and fell away as a burning wreck. Skelton tracked it until it vanished below the cloud deck. 4 German night fighters destroyed in roughly 40 minutes of combat. A night's work that most crews would never see in an entire tour. But in victory, another clock begins to tick. Fuel, ammunition, and the fact that Germany is a large country full of people who would very much like to kill you. Burbridge had spent hundreds of rounds. He had enough for 1 more fight, maybe 2, if he was disciplined. But discipline doesn't matter if you get surrounded. So he did what every good intruder crew did after a strike. He vanished. He descended into cloud, using weather as camouflage. Skelton watched the serret tone behind them weaken and fade. Either the Germans lost them, or they chose not to chase into cloud. Either way, the Mosquito bought itself time. Time to reach the coast. Time to cross the North Sea, time to become a British aircraft again. Flak rose near the coastline, black puffs blooming beneath them like poisonous flowers. But the Mosquito was high and fast, and the shells burst behind. Then the sea was under them, and the darkness became less crowded. Only then did Burbridge allow himself to breathe properly. Only then did Skelton begin writing the combat report with hands that had been steady in battle and now felt oddly human. Times, bearings, locations, claimed types, rounds expended. And the unspoken truth behind all of it. 4 German aircraft meant bomber crews might live tonight. Not all of them, but some. When they landed back at Swannington, the ground crew did what ground crews always did. They counted. They looked for damage. They watched faces. They tried to read the outcome before anyone spoke. Burbridge shut down the engines and climbed out into cold air that smelled like fuel and damp grass. Skelton followed with the log notes in his hand. 4, someone repeated, as if saying it out loud made it real. 4, in one sortie, in one night. Intelligence officers debriefed them in the plain language of war. Where? When? How? What did Serrate show? How did they join the orbit? How close did they get? Did the Germans react? Did they transmit warnings? Were there any signs of new countermeasures? Burbridge answered like a man describing a machine rather than a murder, because that was how you survived mentally. You turned fear into procedure. You turned procedure into a story you could tell without breaking. Word traveled fast through 100 Group. Not because the RAF loved gossip, because success meant tactics. Tactics meant lives. And the method Burbridge used, slipping into the German orbit, was not just bravery. It was proof that the Germans' confidence in their night fighting system contained a fatal flaw. They trusted the darkness too much. Within days, crews were asking to be briefed. Not in lecture halls, in dispersal huts, over mugs of tea that tasted like metal. Because this wasn't theory. This was a technique that let a mosquito put itself inside an enemy formation and kill from within. And once a tactic like that exists, it spreads the way fire spreads. Quietly at first. Then all at once. Here's the key. Before Serrate-style hunting, the Germans hunted bombers using radar. The RAF tried to defend bombers with fighters that were often blind, searching the void. Serrate inverted that relationship. Now, if a German fighter used radar, it could be hunted. If it didn't use radar, it struggled to find bombers. Either choice was bad. That is what electronic warfare does when it works. It doesn't just give you a weapon. It gives your enemy a dilemma. And dilemmas kill more men than bullets. Because dilemmas force mistakes. They force hesitation. They force crews to argue inside the cockpit at the worst moment, radar on or off, approach the stream or wait. Is that friendly? And when those questions take even 5 seconds too long, a mosquito can appear behind you and turn your engine into a torch. German crews began reporting fear during takeoff and landing, moments when speed was low and options were limited. Intruder mosquitoes would lurk near airfields, waiting for returning fighters. A German pilot who survived the bomber stream might still die over his own runway threshold. That psychological pressure mattered. It changed behavior. It reduced aggression. It created what some crews would later describe as a kind of night paranoia. The feeling that any time you switched on radar, you were shouting your position to an enemy you couldn't see. And that is the real legacy of Burbridge and Skelton's kind of mission. Not just the kill tally, not just the medals, but the shift in what night safety meant. The Germans had built an invisible hunting system. The RAF learned to haunt that system like a ghost inside a machine. Now, here's where it gets complicated, and where debate begins. Because the Germans did not sit still. They adapted. They introduced new radar variants. They tried different frequencies. They relied more on ground control. They experimented with detectors of their own, devices designed to sniff out RAF radar emissions, and the RAF responded in kind. Better receivers, modified detectors, deception tactics, jamming, counter-jamming. Night fighting became less about aircraft and more about electronics. You can think of it like this. A Mosquito could be fast, a Ju-88 could be armed, but whichever side understood the electromagnetic battlefield better, that side could decide who saw whom first. And in a night war, first awareness was often the same as first kill. Burbridge and Skelton were not the only crew using Serrate. They were the most famous for a particular kind of success. But their mission became a symbol. Proof that the Germans' proudest night-fighting advantage could be turned against them. If you're building a war machine, the worst moment is when you realize the enemy has learned to use the machine's own strengths as a weakness. That realization spreads panic faster than statistics. Because you can lose aircraft to flak and still believe you're strong. But when you lose aircraft because your most advanced technology is betraying you, you start questioning everything. Burbridge and Skelton continued flying through the winter. More sorties, more interceptions, more nights of signals and darkness. Their partnership became legendary not because they were reckless, but because they were consistent. Find the omission. Close quietly. Strike fast. Disappear. Over and over, until the Luftwaffe began to treat certain areas of sky as poisoned. And then the war began to tilt. By 1945, Germany's fuel situation was collapsing. Pilot training hours fell. Aircraft production struggled under bombing. Veteran crews were exhausted. The night fighter force was still dangerous, still deadly, but it was being starved. And in that starving darkness, any advantage mattered. Surratt gave the RAF a kind of advantage that didn't depend on fuel or armor. It depended on knowledge. After the war, both men moved away from the life you might expect from aces. They did not become Hollywood heroes. They did not spend decades reliving victories. They turned toward theology, ministry, education, lives that looked, from the outside, like the opposite of war. But maybe that's exactly the point, because war shows you what humans can become. And sometimes, when you survive it, you spend the rest of your life trying to rebuild what it broke inside you. Burbridge's oft-repeated principle, aim for engines, not cockpits, has been criticized by some as romantic. War isn't romantic, but the fact that he tried tells you something important about the kind of men flying these missions. Many of them weren't seeking death. They were trying to stop death. There's a difference, even if the outcome for the enemy crew was still the same. So here's the question I want you to wrestle with, because it's the question historians still debate in different forms. Did night fighting change because of aircraft performance or because of electronic warfare? Was the Mosquito speed the real weapon, or was Surratt the real weapon? Because speed doesn't matter if you don't know where to go, and radar doesn't matter if using it gets you killed. There's also a darker question. When you turn war into signals and screens, does it make killing easier? Because you stop seeing a person in another aircraft, you start seeing a tone, a needle, a blip, and you begin to treat human lives as targets generated by a machine. That psychological shift is part of modern warfare, and it started long before computers. It started in cockpits like this one, in nights like November 4th, 1944. Let's replay the mechanics of that night in simple terms. The Germans needed radar to find bomber streams and set up attacks. Radar emissions leaked into the air. Surratt listened for those emissions and pointed Burbridge toward them. The Mosquito speed allowed a stealthy intercept. The Germans rarely looked behind, because their systems were built for hunting forward. Burbridge's discipline, short bursts, close range, made kills fast and minimized exposure. Joining the orbit exploited the Germans' assumption of identity in darkness. Once the orbit broke, the Mosquito escaped before a coordinated response formed. It was not one miracle. It was many small advantages stacked until the Germans couldn't see the trap. And that's why the story matters beyond one night. Because this is what innovation looks like in war, not a single super weapon, but a chain of decisions and tools that turn an enemy habit into a vulnerability. The Germans had a habit: switch on radar, trust it, hunt. Surratt punished that habit, until the habit became fear. Imagine being a German night fighter pilot in late 1944. You climb into your aircraft at an airfield that has been attacked before. You know the bomber stream is coming. You know your ground controller will vector you toward it. You know your radar set, Lichtenstein, is the thing that keeps you alive. But you've heard rumors. British intruders are following radar emissions. British intruders are waiting near airfields. British intruders are killing fighters in the orbit. You don't know which rumors are true. You only know that aircraft are burning near your base that didn't burn last year. So you do what humans always do under fear. You change behavior, you shorten sweeps, you hesitate to turn radar on, you look behind more often, you fly lower, you fly higher. You trust your eyes more than your instruments, but eyes are useless in cloud. So you turn the radar on again, and by doing so, you might be calling your own executioner. That is psychological warfare created by technology, and it's one of the most overlooked parts of WWII aviation history. The Mosquito mattered too. It wasn't only electronics. A slower aircraft would have struggled to exploit serrate bearings before the target drifted away or turned. The Mosquito's speed let crews convert direction into position quickly. Its handling let it slip into patterns and adjust without dramatic changes. Its long range let it operate deep over enemy territory and still come home. Its 4 cannons, mounted tightly, made close-range bursts devastating. And the wooden airframe, oddly, helped in subtle ways. Less metal mass, different reflection characteristics, and a design philosophy centered on speed over armor. But the Mosquito also had a hidden cost. It demanded precision. A pilot who over-controlled at night could lose orientation. A navigator who misread signal strength could lead the aircraft into flak or into the middle of enemy fighters without realizing it. Success wasn't automatic. It was earned, night after night, by crews who lived with the knowledge that one mistake could be their last. There's another group we have to acknowledge here, the bomber crews. Every kill Burbridge and Skelton claimed meant less pressure on the bomber stream, but bomber crews still died. Hundreds, thousands. Serrate did not end the slaughter. It reduced it, and in war, reduce can still mean the difference between a letter arriving at a doorstep and a telegram. When we talk about innovation, we should be honest. Innovation doesn't make war clean. It makes war efficient. Sometimes that efficiency saves lives. Sometimes it just changes who dies first. But the reason 100 Group's mission mattered was simple. Bomber Command's strategy depended on crews reaching targets. German night fighters threatened that strategy. Electronic warfare gave Bomber Command a fighting chance to keep the streams intact long enough to matter. That's the cold math. If you trace a line from Serrate to modern electronic warfare, the concepts are familiar. Passive detection of emissions, classification by signal characteristics, using enemy sensors as beacons, forcing dilemmas, use it and risk exposure, don't use it and lose capability, and integrating electronics with tactics, not treating them as separate. Serrate wasn't the first electronic warfare tool in history, but it was one of the clearest examples of a simple idea changing a complex battlefield. The enemy's searchlight can reveal the enemy. And that idea did not stop in 1945. It grew. It became standard. It became the background reality of modern air combat, naval combat, and even ground warfare. The WWII Night War was, in many ways, the prototype of the sensor versus sensor conflicts that define the present. So why isn't this story better known? Because it's hard to film. Because it's hard to dramatize without turning it into science fiction. Because it involves tones, needles, bearings, things that don't look like heroism. But the truth is that bravery isn't always visible. Sometimes bravery is 2 men sitting in a cockpit, miles from home, trusting a flickering signal enough to fly toward it, knowing that any wrong interpretation could put them in the gun sight of an enemy they will never see. The stealing in your title is poetic, but it captures a real emotional truth. The RAF took something the Germans believed was theirs alone, the power to own the night, and stole it back. Not by building a brighter searchlight, by learning to listen. By the time Burbridge and Skelton reached the English coast on the return leg, the adrenaline had cooled into exhaustion. Their bodies had been locked in tension for hours. Their minds had spent the night converting weak signals into life-or-death decisions. And yet, they had to land cleanly, because the war doesn't stop when you cross the coastline. Landing accidents killed crews too. So Burbridge flew the approach like a man who refused to waste survival. The wheels touched down, the engines wound down, the dispersal point lights glowed, and for a few minutes in a cold Norfolk night, the world was quiet. 4 German night fighters had not reached the bomber stream. Some crews would live because of that. Not all, but some. History often remembers the loud things, explosions, invasions, speeches. But war is also won by quiet reversals like this. A signal becomes a confession, a hunter becomes prey, a night that once belonged to one side becomes contested. And once the night is contested, the entire war shifts by degrees. If you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person this channel is for. So here's my question for you. Do you think electronic warfare mattered more than aircraft design in changing the night war? Would the Mosquito have been decisive without Surate, or would Surate have been decisive without a Mosquito fast enough to exploit it? Drop your take in the comments. I read them, and the best arguments shape future episodes. And if you want more WWII stories that live in the shadows, radar wars, deception operations, odd weapons, impossible tactics, hit subscribe on WWII Hidden Chapters. Because the war has 1,000 famous chapters, but the most important ones are often the ones people forget. Thanks for watching. And as always, stay curious and keep the history alive.